to introduce you, Claudia, as I was one of your students last year. Claudia Tazreiter, you are... Can you hear me well? Yeah, I heard some noise. So you are working as a professor of ethnic and migration studies at the Institute for Research on Migration, Ethnicity and Society at Linköping University in Sweden. You have been working with Behrooz Boukhani, who was your colleague in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at the University of New South Wales, and who have been detained in Papua New Guinea for more than 6 years as a refugee. Today, you will be talking about positionality in migration studies and explore some ethical and methodological considerations, drawing, among other things, on the work you did with Behrooz Boukhani on Manus Island. Thank you so much for being here, Claudia, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marie. Thank you for the warm introduction, and nice to be here with you all. Thank you for Jeremy for organising the series. I think it's a really fantastic series and range of topics. I do have a few slides, mainly they're visual triggers, and I will see if I can share them. Otherwise, I think, Anita, you also have them. Okay, I think it's not allowing me to share, Anita. So if you don't mind opening the slides, and then I will just ask you to move them as we go. So I am going, I'll just start, and I think you'll see the slides in a moment. But
I don't have them. I think Jeremy has to resend them to me again because I didn't receive I received the email, but not the attached file. I'm sorry. So Jeremy, if you don't mind sending me the email again, or sharing it on your side as you prefer. I'm sorry.
Yes, I'll try to share them if it's working. And no problem. Sorry. Up. Sorry, I just have to share. Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Now it's okay.
Okay. Yeah. Great.
So yes. Jeremy, if you just go straight to the second slide for me.
Yes.
Great. And I think, can you do slide view, or is that going to ruin?
No, of course I can.
Okay, so I've just popped up there the short description which you all have, and I really just wanted to do that to give you a little bit of a context for what I thought I would talk about today and share with you, and then I'm very happy to also be in discussion with you, because I would like to enter this field of research positionality and also thinking about the ethics of the research that we do in relation to the changes in my own view as a researcher over time in how I've come to think about the subject of the research in the traditional social science way, to really now seeing the people that I work with as co-researchers and as collaborators. And I think that makes a great deal of difference. And I thought that to enter that conversation, I would do that through the example of work that I've done with a number of different vulnerable migrant communities, and particularly refugee communities. So I'm going to focus on the work that I've done with Behrooz Boukhani and with other refugees that have been detained on a place called Manus Island in Papua New Guinea. And but the bigger context is that this also relates to research that I've done in Indonesia and in Malaysia with refugee communities, and then a longer longer lens is also research in the Middle East, particularly in the West Bank, the Palestinian territories, and also some in Europe. But I'm going to focus my comments really on this collaboration on Manus Island and reflect on the sort of dilemmas that I think a lot of researchers have faced. And Marie, you mentioned in your introduction that Behrouz Boochani is sort of affiliated with the University of New South Wales in Sydney, where I used to work before I came to Sweden. And so he does have that affiliation, but he has that affiliation through my visit to Manus Island. And so I'll talk about that a little bit as well, because for me, the bigger context and the question that I regularly ask myself and also work through with students in the classroom is, what is the role of research, right? Why do we do research? And who are our audiences? And I think the answer to those questions makes a great deal of difference in terms of how we scope a project, how we imagine it, and how we write it as well. And of course, for me, and I think for many of us that work in the field of critical migration studies, the work and the research is always political. It has a strong political context. And so I think that is important. And I'll talk about that through the example and through the case study, because I think it makes the most sense. So Jeremy, can you just forward 2 slides? The next slide is just talking a little bit about the 2 readings that I set you, which we can be in discussion about. And yeah, so this slide shows you the geography and the spatial relationship of what's going on here in terms of externalizing borders, which Europe is now in the midst of and has been doing since 2015 and perhaps even before, externalizing the border and really pushing refugee communities and responsibility for refugee protection to other states. And Australia is a territory that started perfecting this governmentality of externalizing the border already in 2001, and arguably even earlier in the 90s, and has perfected it in a way that Europe hasn't yet managed to do, also because Europe has a Human Rights Act and for many other reasons. But you can see Manus Island is this tiny little dot at the top of, so above Australia is Papua New Guinea, and then there is this tiny little dot in the Bismarck Sea that is Manus. And so Manus, you can see, is remote, even from Papua New Guinea. And it takes a long time to get there from, I was living in Sydney at the time. I visited Manus Island in 2019 and met Behrouz for the first time. And it's very hard to get there. So it's expensive, it's remote, and the Australian government had also instituted a range of new laws that criminalised journalists and doctors in particular for going to Manus Island, made it very difficult for people to get there. And so I'll talk a little bit more about the history and the context, just to give you a shape of it. But I think many of you know a little bit about that history and the way that these politics are being utilised in other jurisdictions. So I had been working on these topics for many, many years, but then became aware, as did many other people, that many of the people that were detained under this, what I, along with my collaborators, so Behrouz Boochani and Ahmed Tafigian, who you also wrote, who you also read. So he is the translator of a lot of Behrouz's work. But they also became collaborators. So they started co-writing and co-producing a lot of work. I'll talk about that a little bit later. So I became aware of the work that was being produced from this remote island detention centre that we that lived in Australia knew a little bit about it, but the news was very hard to get. And often we would only receive updates if one or other of the men and boys that were detained had access to a mobile phone, which they only did from time to time, and if there was sufficient coverage, internet coverage, that we would receive updates from them. And so Beirut started to write. So he was a journalist in Iran. He's a Kurdish Iranian journalist, and his journalism is the reason he became a refugee. So he started writing works of journalism about Manus Island and about the Australian government's policies, and they were published in The Guardian, they were published in the New York Times, and so he became quite well known, and the international community started to take notice. Jeremy, can you go to the next slide, please? But of course, the bigger context that we see here, and what Beirut and others were also working with, is that the context of what happened on Manus Island was not just one specific case. It mapped onto international developments, and it obviously maps onto what many critical migration scholars have been working on for a few decades. That is, why does migration become a crisis moment, right? And certainly you see this in the Asia Pacific much earlier than has been occurring in Europe. But you see these moments of crisis where, you know, this is the image of the lifeboat, the image of a life raft. And Jeremy, please go to the next image. And this very common trope from many political leaders of lives lost at sea. In other words, that we have to be tough on boat people, and we have to be tough on border crossers, because what we're doing is saving lives. And so please go to the next image. And so many researchers were working in this area, were working on policies, and also working on documenting the stories of the migrants and of the border crossers, and working in policy domains, working in many other fields. But what I also became aware of from refugee voices themselves was that people were documenting their own experiences, and often documenting them through visual cultures, right? So using visual methodologies along with traditional social science methodologies. But many people also started to document objects, right? So here you have the life jacket, that often all that is left behind, the remnants of the lives lost at sea, are objects. So the materiality of the human rights issues that are going on. Jeremy, the next slide, please. And so what I had been working on, and what I continued to work on with Beirut when I met him, and when I was talking to him on Manus Island, and talking with other refugees, and talking with Ahmed to understand their focus and what did they want researchers to work on, is this deep integration between the histories of race and racialization and bordering practices, and the way that the hierarchies of value, so the hierarchies of the human, are embedded in people's experience. And the reason I raise this in those couple of bullet points with some of the writers and some of the different traditions that work on the intersections of these areas, the reason I raise it is that you'll see I'll come to the end in the brief talk that I'm giving today on the relationship with other communities, with other minoritized populations, and the way in which I observed through the work that I was able to do and the access that I gained through Beirut and others to develop my own knowledge and develop my own research practices with other communities, such as Indigenous people. You see from Ahmed's article that I sent you, a collaboration, another kind of collaboration that developed between Australian First Nations communities and refugees who had been part of Australia's carceral archipelago. And so what I'm going to turn to now, you can move to the next slide, Jeremy. What I'm going to turn to now is just to give you a brief characterization of some of the productive works, right? So some of the research outputs, really, some of the forms of both resistance, so speaking back to the state and imagining a different kind of future, but also other forms of creative work, right? Developing works that really are research-led works because there are deep ideas behind these works that emerged from the refugees themselves. And really often my role and the role of other researchers and other collaborators was to help and to facilitate, but not necessarily as the producers of the research itself. So what you can see, I've just documented here for you some of the outputs, and I am focusing on Behrouz Bachani, but there are many, many others who also are part of this productive field. And what you start to see on Manus Island, also on other sites, so Nauru is a small Pacific island nation where other refugees were also detained. Manus is an island where Australia decided, for its own reasons that I think are still not completely clear, to only send men and boys to this particular island and to be detained there, many for 7, 8, 9 years. And we can talk about that later in discussion, but I think there is a particular kind of cruelty and design by the state in detaining only men and young boys together, which one of these creative works also speaks to. So a lot of filmmakers and artists and later Indigenous people in Australia, you see some of these creative collaborations. One is with Hoda Afshar, who took this particular portrait of Behrouz. And please, the next slide, Jeremy. And so another work which is available, you can find it online, is a feature film that Behrouz created together with other refugees, but Behrouz was the main instigator, and with an Iranian filmmaker based in the Netherlands called Arash Saravastani. And the film called Chowka, Please Tell Us the Time it's a feature film. It's not really a documentary, it's more a feature film that really narrates what it's like to be on Manus and what it's like to be in detention. And this film, along with all the other works that were created on Manus, it took many years to make the film and the other creative works because the only means that they had, in this case Behrouz, was a mobile phone. And so small video takes and then text messages about the scene and how the work ought to be edited were sent piece by piece over several years to Arash. And Jeremy, please, to the next 2 slides. So the next 2 slides show you a few stills from the film, and the film also documents some of the protests that took place over time. And so the next piece of work that I'm just going to characterize, the next slide, please, Jeremy, is a book. So it's a book called No Friend But the Mountains. It was published in 2018. And it's a book that has now been translated into, I think, 20 languages. At the end of 2018, it won the biggest literary award in Australia. At that time, Behrouz was still in detention. And so it's a book of poetry, but it's also a book of critique. So he and Ahmed Tawfiqian Ahmed translated the book, and it's a big book. Ahmed talks in many of his works about the process of translation, but also the process of receiving these small text messages. And sometimes there would be several months with no messages coming through because the men were, that there were sit-ins, there were protests. Some of the men died at the hands of guards, which I'll talk about in a moment. And so there were many times where Ahmed thought, this will never be realised. This book, this research will never be realised. But the book has spawned a lot of ideas because it also develops a form of theorising, right? So theorising detention. It's a memoir, it's a book of poetry, but it's also a work of imagining a different kind of future. So it connects with marginalised groups and peoples in many different types of circumstances. So Jeremy, the next slide, please. So the another work that was co-created. So this is a video work that you can find it freely available on Vimeo. It's a video work of about 15 minutes or so called Remain. And Hoda Afshar went to Manus Island in 2018. At that stage, the detention centre was officially closed because the High Court of Papua New Guinea ruled that detention of refugees without a time limit was unconstitutional according to the Papua New Guinea constitution. So the detention centre was closed, but the refugees were kept in containers and had a nightly curfew, so they were still on Manus. She was able to shoot this video together with the men. You can go to the next slide, Jeremy. And the video work narrates the story of their friend Reza Barati. So Reza is one of a number of men who lost their lives on Manus Island. And Reza Barati was 24, and he was bashed to death by 10 guards, some Australian and some from Papua New Guinea, while the prisoners were protesting about the conditions of their detention. The next slide, please, Jeremy. And there's one more slide, I think, from, yes, so that's the last slide. So this video work, and it's, you know, a lot at the Beirut, Hoda Afshar, who's a very well-known photographer, Ahmed and others have written about these forms of collaboration, how and why these forms of collaboration were possible, and also the ethical context of the stories that they were telling. And okay, so one more slide, please, Jeremy, the next one. So I'm going to wind up in about 3 or 4 minutes, and then we'll have some time for discussion. But what I wanted to do ultimately in bringing this all together is also bring in the other types of voices that Beirut and others have started collaborating with, and the way that researchers, not just myself, but we, some years ago, I, together with a colleague, started a research network called the Forced Migration Research Network. And it's really this network that has worked really hard to connect researchers with the communities they work with. And we've held lots of events, but also continue to work in terms of how can our work be ethically grounded. If we're co-creating research with vulnerable communities, that also means that we have to ask them, what is it that they would like research to do? What do they imagine is the role of research, and what sort of outcomes would they like from the research process? And so some of this has occurred through some of these other groups, such as Indigenous Australians. And really, you know, I think I have learned a lot from these collaborations. And I've learned a lot that I can also bring into my research about the links between colonial histories of incarceration and contemporary practices of incarceration. And so some of these works, such as the one that Omid talks about in the article I sent you, so that's a dance work that was created by First Nations Australians together with refugees who'd been detained on Manus Island and Nauru. And they created a public performance that's about the histories and the contemporary aspects of incarceration and what the state does to people and to people's bodies. And then, so in wrapping up, if you go to the next slide, please, Jeremy. I think the other thing that the other very important role of researchers is in helping to, in documenting, but also in helping to document these histories. So, for example, one of the things that occurred is the Manus Island Detention Centre. After it was closed and with a lot of international criticism and so on, the Australian government decided to deconstruct the detention centre, and it's been razed to the ground. And so if you go to that site today, it's been completely returned to the jungle. There is no physical remainder of the detention centre. And so what some researchers at Melbourne University have done, together with refugees, is to document these histories. So to document the history with the narratives and with the stories of the men and boys detained on Manus. So one of the things, if you go to that site, one of the things that you'll see is they have, together with architects, created a virtual recreation of the detention centre. So that, in other words, Australian citizens, but also citizens of the world, can be in no doubt about what happened on this site, what the site looked like. And then the next slide, Jeremy, which is my last slide. And then to also keep raising awareness, but also pay homage to the many different men and boys that lost their lives. And so that's a page that shows on this virtual platform that shows two. Reza Barati, that died at the hands of the guards, and another young man, Hamid Karzai, who died of medical neglect. He had stepped on a nail and had sepsis in his foot, and he was left untreated for more than 2 weeks. And by the time he was medevaced to Australia, because Manus doesn't have a functioning hospital, he had a massive heart attack and died. So I think that this history of documenting and of researchers having a role in helping to recreate, but really listening to the voices of those who have suffered from these policies is for me a key part of the research process, but also the ethics of what we do in this field. And I'll leave it there, and very happy to be in discussion with you.
Thank you very much, Claudia. Now the floor is open for discussion.